Many moves can be played against one e4, but I'm going to take a look at the Scandinavian defense, and that is e4 and d5, and that's the position you can see on the board. After d5, white has, well, a number of choices. Obviously, he's not forced to take. He takes d5. He can also play knight c3, d4, e5, or whatever. But if we're going to talk about the Scandinavian defense, white plays e takes d5, and I also believe that you will see this in, like, I don't know, 9 or maybe even 10 out of 10 cases. It depends. And objectively, the best move here, I suppose, is knight to f6, because of the queen takes d5, which is the main move that I'm going to take a look at. I will obviously cover queen d6 and maybe a brief look at the knight f6 as well. But the main move is queen takes d5. And after queen takes d5, like I said, objectively knight f6 is better because of the knight c3, even though white is not actually forced to play knight c3, you can also play knight f3, you can play d4. But after knight c3, and I believe a long time ago when this opening was first played, like I don't know how long, maybe 100 years or something like that, it was believed that knight c3 immediately refuted this opening because it looks like black just loses the tempo of the knight c3. But the thing about knight c3 is that once the knight is on c3, it's not actually that great because the c pawn cannot be developed. So for example, if the knight c3, queen a5 and d4, this d4 pawn could potentially come under some attack. And if we again take a look at the main moves here, knight f6, and also, by the way, the move d4 or the pawn on d4 could come under some fire. For example, if black chooses the variation to play queen d6 and castle along, and then he has probably a knight on c6, a rook on d8, and a queen on d. Well, could perhaps be on the d file as well, and then there's a huge pressure on the d4 pawn. But in this scenario, you have knight f6, knight f3, c6. c6 is played, well, for two reasons basically. One is that the black queen can always retreat to d8 or c7 or something, and the other is to stop. Well, not necessarily stop, but making d5 move a little bit more difficult for white, because d5 is pretty much a key move for white in the Scandinavian defense. The main move here is bishop c4, at least according to my book, but there's also bishop d2, and you will see this a lot in the Scandinavian. And the idea is basically to, well, there's a discovery on the queen. So for example, bishop f5, bishop c4, e6, and white could immediately play knight d5. It's not a problem for black, obviously, because black can just go back to d8. So like I said, when c6 was played, the queen can immediately go back to d8 and just takes. And here I think g takes f6 is better than queen takes, because potentially the queen could be attacked with bishop g5. So I think g takes f6 is better. But if this happens, then also the g pawn, or, well, let's say the double pawns on the f file now makes it impossible for white to play something like knight to e5, which is also, by the way, a very typical move in the Scandinavian. But if we stick to the main moves, it's not, white doesn't play bishop d2, but bishop c4. And here, for example, bishop f5, and here bishop d2. It's basically the same thing, except that now white has the option to castle whenever he wants. So for example, after e6, again, white could play knight d5, but the main move is queen e2. And now we can also see the point with d5, although it's not actually, well, it could be a potential idea, maybe not at this point, but when white plays d5, this pawn on e6 is pinned, and black cannot take back because it's, well, there's a queen on e2. So bishop b4, for example, castles, knight b d7, d5. Well, it's hardly ever played. I'm not even sure if it works here. So for example, if d5, c takes, knight takes, and now we have something like knight takes, d5, bishop takes, d5, bishop takes, rook takes, and well, obviously black can't take the bishop because this pawn on e6 is pinned. But you know, this is hardly ever played. So I think instead of that, bishop b4, castles long, knight b d7, a3 is played. And now bishop takes c3, bishop takes c3, queen c7. And here d5 could actually be an idea. So d5 in any event is something you have to keep an eye on, because it could happen any time. So knight e5, for example, knight takes, d takes, knight d5. I think black is pretty much okay here. So for example, bishop d2, just to avoid any exchanges. I mean, white doesn't want to give up his any of these two bishops for the knight, so he simply moves back to d2. And now black could castle short, but the most common move, I believe, is castles long, followed by g4, bishop g6, f4, h5, h3. H takes g4 is okay, but I think queen b6 is played the most. Rook f1, h takes g4, h takes g4, queen c5, bishop e3, rook h3. We can also take a look at, obviously f5 doesn't work. For example, let's see. Yeah, I mean, white simply loses a pawn after f5, even though f5 is actually an opening. It's actually theory, so e takes, and instead of taking back e6, h takes g6, no, g4, sorry, e takes f7, bishop takes f7. This is actually opening theory, but I don't think this is as good as h3 and then the moves that we looked at. And this is the end of the variation, at least in my book. I'm not sure if it actually goes much further than this. So obviously there could be a trade on f3, or maybe the rook could go to h1, it depends. So those are the main moves. And if we go all the way back here to queen a5, instead of queen a5, knight c3, queen d6. Queen d6, I think it's a newer move than queen a5. And it is also preferred by grandmasters such as TV Yakov, who plays the Scandinavian Defence frequently with good results. I think he's probably one of the very few on high level who plays the Scandinavian, even though it happens now and then, even on the highest level. Okay, d4, knight f6, knight f3, a6, g3, bishop g4. You might wonder what happens after b5. Now b5 looks very tempting because, I mean, when you play a6, it makes a lot of sense to play b5. And b5 is actually the most common, the next move, so to speak, that is played, even though bishop g4 is the most common here. But b5 is possible. And two moves come to mind here. One is bishop g2, and the other is bishop f4. So for example, if we start with bishop g2, there's a potential discovery on the rook, so let's say bishop b7. And here again are two main moves, or moves that could potentially happen here. For example, castles or bishop f4. Either of those two moves. So let's say castles, e6, bishop f4. And here, now it looks perfectly natural to play something like queen b6. Because what could be better than that? I mean, the queen protects. First, he steps out of, you know, the attack, but he also goes to a square where he keeps an eye on this bishop on b7. So let's say queen b6. But here, a4 is actually a move that gives black a little bit of a problem. For example, if we play b4, a5, queen a7, and now bishop takes c7. And well, I don't probably have to mention this, but if black takes this knight, then black can just resign after bishop b6. He loses his queen. So that doesn't happen. So knight b d7, and now the knight just moves away to, I don't know, e2 for example, and black is just down a pawn. So we saw that the move a4 is actually kind of annoying. There is also bishop d6. with the idea that after a5, for example, queen a7, now this pawn on c7 is not actually under attack. So let's say he could take on d6, but that would just strengthen black's center, so I think he would go to e3. Also a little bit annoying for black, because, you know, if d5 is ever played, the queen is immediately under attack. c5 is also a possible move, but I think knight d5 is even better, because it stops any discoveries. So the knight goes to, for example, g5, or he can also go to e4, knight e4, like this. But for example, if knight g5, there are two. I mean, you have the bishop attacking, you have the knight attacking, and black might have an isolated. Well, it's not actually an isolated pawn after e takes d5, because there's also the c pawn. But this is an idea. Okay, c5, for example, knight e2. Well, I don't quite like c5 that very much, because, you know, if d5 or it takes over here, then there is something hanging in there. For example, if this pawn would ever move, let's just make a bad move here, c4 and then just d5. Okay, black could go, of course, over here, but then just a trade and then takes over here, and I think white is just better. c5 again is playable, but I don't know. So that's what happens after the move b5. But I said the most played move here is bishop g2, but there is also bishop f4 and queen b6. a4 is possible, of course, but b4, a5, queen a7. Okay. Let's see. In the previous variation, when black played bishop g2, bishop e7, castles, e6, bishop f4, queen b6, the difference is that after a4, b4, the bishop is now on b7, but in the previous variation the bishop was on c8 and the queen could protect the c7 pawn. So maybe that's a little bit more comfortable for black. So bishop b5, bishop g2, let's say bishop f4. This is actually better for black. So and that's obviously the reason why bishop g2 is more often played than bishop f4, for that simple reason, I think. Even though it's perfectly fine for white, but it makes life a little bit easier for black. So bishop g2, and we already looked at those lines. Okay, let's go a little bit deeper in this. Queen b6, a4 for example, b4, a5, queen e7, knight a4, e6, bishop g2, knight e5, bishop g2, knight b7, c4. And this is the end of the line. Okay, let's go all the way back. So obviously a b5 is not the most common move. So bishop g4 is played more often, probably because of all these complications that we saw after the move a4. h3 is a move, but the most common is again bishop g2, knight c6, castles long, knight d5, knight bd4, knight b4, h3, bishop h5, bishop f4, queen c5. I'm not too crazy about this. Bishop e3, and this could even be a draw immediately. Obviously bishop f4 makes a lot of sense. The queen could go to b6, but I mean, if white wants a draw, then you obviously take a draw. If you're not better, that is, but black is not better here. So h3 is a very common move, but let's see. bishop g4, bishop g2, knight c6, castles along, d5. Well, is this pawn strong or is it weak? That's the question. Of the knight before, it's attacked actually 4 times by this knight, this rook, and this queen. But after h3, for example, the bishop has to move. Bishop h5, for example, bishop f4, and now again we could have a repetition. Okay, let's take a look at the other moves. So that's knight c3. There is also knight f3, obviously. Knight f6, d4, bishop g4, bishop e2, knight c6, c4, queen h5. h3 doesn't make that much sense because obviously there's no threat because white can't take. But if the castle's long, castle short, now there is a threat obviously. But in fact, black can sacrifice this by playing knight takes e4. If knight takes e4, bishop takes e2, queen takes, rook takes. So that's what happens. What else? So, okay, what happens if h takes g3? Okay, let's see. If this move, what is this? So if you give black another move like e5, well, let's say knight c3. We'll say something else. How about this move? But then, or maybe not even that. Well, e5 is obviously a bad move, but it is actually played. Knight h4 is opening theory, but it just makes me wonder what happens. Does black actually have a threat here? Knight h4, rook takes, bishop takes, queen takes, rook takes. Well, it seems to me that black is just down a piece. Well, this is strange. I'm not running an engine here either, so I can't tell. But it looks very strange to me after e5. But e5 is obviously not play, so knight takes d4 like I showed before, and then just bishop takes, queen takes, rook takes. And here queen c2, for example. Okay. So queen takes d5 and knight f3 is also a move, but there's also d4, knight f6, knight f3, bishop g4, bishop e2, knight c6, c4, and the queen could go to f5 as well. But I think h5 is better. But then we could have the same line as we had before. And here e5 is a move. I'm not so sure if I like the long castle for black because I mean things could really explode on the queen side, but it looks a little bit safer on the king side, to be honest. So obviously it's not necessary to castle long here for black, but I don't know. He could try e6, knight c3, bishop e4, a3, bishop takes, b takes, and castle short. This is also playable, I suppose. And maybe I should also mention instead of queen takes d5 and knight f6, I have made a video about this before, I think, but it might be worth taking a look at again. It is a little bit more complicated, I believe, but it's possible to play this way for black.